Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fifth roundtable in our series of roundtables about the urban environment in South-East Queensland. I'm Claire Moore from the United Nations Association of Queensland, who've been one of the co-sponsors of this series of roundtables. My friend Danelle Davis, whom you all know and has been driving this program for so long, can't be with us today, so we're being allowed to go by ourselves. But as you all know, this is being taped and Danelle will be watching at some time. So my job is to welcome you all and also begin, as always, with acknowledging the traditional owners of the various lands on which we're meeting, to acknowledge their work, their land which has never been ceded, and to also look forward to a land where there is true reconciliation. We also acknowledge elders of all cultures. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Pamela, who is going to do the general wrap-up of why we're all here and why we're looking at SDG 11, which is about the urban environment being safe, inclusive, resilient and sustainable, and where these roundtables fit. Then we have three volunteer speakers and I'll introduce them now so that when we get down to the part where Pamela asks some questions, we can get right into the questions and not do the intros. So Pamela, who I think you've seen her face popping up a bit there. Pamela is an urban designer and planner, and also I'm very pleased to say United Nations Association volunteer. She has during the pandemic moved from Brisbane from Geelong, where she is responsible for establishing City of Greater Geelong's urban design and heritage, until shortly after Geelong was designated Australia's first UNESCO City of Design. Pamela has studied and worked around the world, most recently in London and Milan. It's added here, Pamela, that you're the mother of three small daughters under 4, which I think deserves a special award. You're an MBA candidate by night and a United Nations Association volunteer in between. So, Pamela, we'll pass on to you soon, but I'll just do the quick introductions of Toby, Pete and Ross. Now, Toby Fulbert is a registered landscape architect, urban play and co-founder of Seven Senses Foundation. Educated in Hanover, Germany, prior to his move to Australia, Toby was involved in community consultation, LA projects in Germany, New Zealand and Australia. I love these words. I'm going to read them out, even though you're probably going to cringe, Toby. Passionate about sustainability, permaculture and inclusive design, Toby has been publicly speaking about the merits of Seven Senses design framework around Australia for over 10 years. He's currently involved in 2 research projects with QUT and is soon to a long holiday back to Germany, which he might tell you about in the Q&A session. Dr. Pete Phillott is an engagement and collaboration specialist, International Water Centre. Now, I'm going to do a bit of this formal stuff, Pete, but I actually liked what you said, that you're a matchmaker between people and ideas. I really like that, and I hope we talk more about that later. But you've got over 30 years experience in natural resources and environmental management roles in our state, local government and NGOs. Your focus has evolved from a science specialist to a strategic planner, to a science advocate, and now you're an engagement and collaboration specialist. That's probably that matchmaker bit. Pete's current interest in proactive flood resilience design and implementation, water modelling and the use for decision makers, urban and regional water management, storytelling and communication for science professionals. And the third speaker is Ross Elliott, who in the black print it says Ross, Executive Engagement, Industry Advocate and Business Strategy Specialist. Ross is chair of both the Lord Mayor's Better Suburbs Initiative and the Urban Land Institute Brisbane District Council. He's also the director of the Suburban Alliance and members of both the Toowoomba CBD and Railway Parklands Priority Development Area, Expert Advisory Panel and Property Council of Australia's Social Infrastructure Committee. So they're the people we've got speaking today, and now I'll hand over to Pamela, who'll be able to put into context around SDG 11, which is our focus from the UN's perspective of this afternoon's program. Thank you, Pamela.
Thanks, Claire. Shall we do the anthem first, actually? Danelle usually sings this for me, which I will not
I don't
talk
have
for everyone.
I don't have the button for the anthem, Pamela.
Okay, great.
I don't know enough, but it's really pretty. But I know Wendy Flannery is one of the participants, and I know she can sing it, but I won't embarrass her.
All right. I won't embarrass myself and butcher it either. So I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we gather here across Australia from various locations that we're calling in from, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As Claire said, Danelle unfortunately isn't able to make it today, but I thought it was worth going through a little bit of the content that she does for each of these roundtable sessions to give you, the sort of context in which we do these sessions and for the conversation ahead. In January 2017, we, with 78 others at UNAA, held a workshop with a very diverse group of leaders, community groups, urban design professionals across, I guess, 8 disciplines. And the result was having a look at the SDG 11 and a dialogue on the 8 policy areas that fall out of SDG 11 and Habitat 3. And we came up with a South-East Queensland People's Declaration for a Preferred Future for South-East Queensland under the framework of Habitat 3. We had quite a lot of support from councillors and ministers of the day, but very little feedback, unfortunately. But we did have community groups, had a much more focused, a greater focus of where they should put their energies together. So, that was a successful outcome. What we're looking at now, 5 years on, is that since then, we've obviously had floods, cyclones, bushfires, COVID, economic havoc in industries, and we've had sort of crisis-led development from about 2017 to 2021 that we're now having a look at how we've been progressing with that declaration 5 years on, and we will again have a look at it in another 5 years, how we're tracking with some of the targets of SDG 11, and in particular today's session is about one of the policy areas of SDG 11 Habitat 3, which is spatial development, which is implemented through, I suppose, and benchmarked by spatial justice. Yes, so I guess by way of background, we're looking at what sort of future for South-East Queensland do we want based on benchmarking that has been happening in the SDG space and before the SDGs actually. We have a synthesis paper that you should be able to find a link to that includes a report card from 2003 where we sort of benchmarked various aspects of quality of life and everything in South-East Queensland. We had a look at the state of the regions report in 2008, which had some very good measuring by way of sort of green, yellow, red indicators of how we were progressing in terms of sustainable development. And actually under urban development, we were rating quite highly, particularly when benchmarked against other regions, not just here, but overseas. And then there was some 2017 benchmarking that benchmarked South-East Queensland as a region, again, against regions throughout the world. So now we come to 5 years since the SDGs was deliberated in Quito, and we are in South-East Queensland looking at 10 years to plan for the Olympics, and the world will be reviewing, I guess, our strategy and how we invest in the locality and for resilience. We're looking at, in the wake of COVID, our cities are being scrutinised for how we repurpose and value the economy and the community, and benchmarking elsewhere. There's opportunities for lessons to be learned. So today is also about having conversations about what is happening abroad that we could learn from as well as what are we doing really well. So I guess these roundtable sessions are a conversation about where from, where to, and how, looking at, in today particularly, the spatial justice, so that in another 5 years we can revisit it and say, you know, are we again moving negatively in some aspects where we weren't expecting, or are we moving positively? I guess to sort of define it, spatial justice, I will sort of say that there's, I guess it's a relatively new concept, and there's sort of two focus areas, because it can be seen as both a process and an outcome. So you have distributive justice, which is, it's about the creation of fair allocation of and access to public goods, resources and services throughout the city. And then you have procedural justice, which is how cities and communities are negotiated, planned, designed and managed in the procedures of negotiation and decision making. So an example of that is, you know, planning processes that are transparent, allow some form of participation, that are bound to be, they're bound to be more just than those which don't, for example. But also spatial justice is sort of an evaluation framework that enables, you know, action to improve our cities and make them more livable and socially sustainable. So in terms of SDG 11, I guess we're looking at 3 areas within it. Specific targets we're talking about are 11.4, 5 and 7, which really brings together, you know, social justice being this concept of, you know, socially just in, you know, environmental resilience, but also long-term value. Yeah, so unfortunately I had a really good slide, I thought, that showed some key visuals of, you know, South-East Queensland cities and human settlements, which was an area of, you know, Gold Coast, sort of Brisbane region. Also some disaster photos from the floods. Also a street where I used to live in Bridgian Springs that obviously had some bushfires, but also sustainable transport in terms of a woman cycling and children scooting and active travel to schools, which is obviously something that I'm quite passionate about, being a mother of 3 under 4. And so I guess the first question is, in this sort of context, where do you think that the children will play in the next 5, 10, 15 years in light of the development that's happening across South-East Queensland?
And maybe I start on that. Happy to start on that. Obviously, play is my passion, play is my thing. Growing up in, well, I have to say, like, I'm coming from Germany. So I grew up in a play street. So the neighborhood was our playgrounds. Like, you could play everywhere. And I think for me, it was always like, play is everything and play is everywhere. And the developments you are seeing is exactly nearly the opposite. Like, I have 2 kids, and the neighborhoods here in Australia, a lot of them are not designed that the kids can actually walk to school, that they can cycle to school, that they can actually, I call it, as a landscape architect, I design wildlife corridors to make sure that a koala can go from A to B, but we actually don't create something for us. So I think this whole notion of human corridors is really important. And my vision would be, because there's a lot of change happening now, and like hearing from Ross, like with better suburbs, like there's all this discussion about it, but how do we create actually neighborhoods that are playable? And all the public realms should be playable. So I'm hoping that the kids will play everywhere and anywhere, but I still think there's a challenge at the moment where even with like designing playgrounds, we can only from a policy point of view, I can only put a playground in a designated park. And then we have all these different categories of pocket park and district park and citywide park. For me, it's like, and again, I saw that in Germany, I see that in the Netherlands, plays everywhere. So how do we create playable urban design? Why can't we play elements at a bus stop? And how do we actually create our neighborhoods more playable, and then going into intergenerational as well, not just for kids, how do we create actually fun and healthier communities for all ages? So that's being truly intergenerational and truly inclusive beyond accessibility. So we really have to look at how do we redesign our streets to make them more safe, because I think that's, the school is so long here as well. So what I found in Germany, my school was finished at 12:30. By 1:30, I was done with my homework and I was just playing in the neighborhood. Here, my kids are coming home at 3:30, then they still have to do homework, and then there's nothing wrong, then they play in their front yard. And then even I turned my front yard into a playground more or less for the community. But it's still interesting, all my neighbors, they don't let their kids out. So it's still my kids in the front yard playing, trying to connect with us, but everybody is so scared of stranger danger. But I think that's really the easiest, to actually turn our neighborhoods into more playable spaces that it's easy for everybody to access this space. And I think every public realm, there's so much pressure now on, because obviously we're getting more and more density in our cities. Like the people have less and less space where they can be connected, where they can socialize. Loneliness is a massive issue we have in society. So how do we create the spaces where it is safe to be together? And I think that's another thing I found crazy in Australia. We're doing amazing parklands, and we're doing them, when we look at multi-generational spaces, we're doing it great, but it's not intergenerational. So we still create silos. Like we create, here's a space for the toddlers, it's fully fenced off. Here's a space for the teenagers. Here's a space for this. But then, like my parents live in Germany, my wife's parents are in Germany, so my kids never meet elderly people. So for an elderly person to meander through a park to sit at a bench at a playground, it's nearly a no-no. So how do we design that? Like, why don't we open the spaces up and really create spaces where everybody has a permission to be in and then be connected? And I think that's really the approach we need to take as designers, and work together with different, I guess, disciplines. And that's what I love from Pete as well. It's not about we as playground designers, we all have to come together. Alone we can go so far, but together we can go so much further. And we really have to bring all these different expertises together. The other thing, and when I started my Seven Senses Foundation in 2013, I was so sure by now every urban design company would have occupational therapists, psychologists, all these people within the office to actually be part of the design process. I'm so lucky my wife is an occupational therapist, so she always like challenges me on that. But again, we can't know everything, and we don't need to know everything, but we have to collaborate with the right people and not force it from a design perspective, and actually a lot of times losing the human-centric approach to it. And that's what we're doing. We're creating a lot of beautiful infrastructure, but it's soulless. And I have to say, like a lot of, like even our houses, I call our houses here in Australia, they're all on life support. Like you have to, they're dead. So you go into the houses, you have to put a light on, otherwise there's no natural light, and you have to put the aircon on, and they should be actually breathing. So it's like, yeah, sorry, I'm just coming off topic here, but for me it is really like, I think the opportunity is there that they could play everywhere and anywhere. We're living in the best, in South-East Queensland, it's the best climate in the world, and we're still locking our kids up into these rooms, and then we wonder why we have anxiety levels going through the roofs and whether everybody's just on the consoles. Yeah, there's nothing where they can actually be out there. Sorry, I stop here.
Fantastic.
Yeah, look, building off Tobias, like I suppose I reflect when I grew up in Ipswich, and I actually rode my bike everywhere. My parents had to go to work early, so I used to commute everywhere on my bike, and it was safe then, and played a lot. So yeah, I suppose I have a history of playing, and then did the normal sporting things, played soccer for many years and all sorts of other things, and tennis. So there was always activity in spaces that were created. But I suppose I like Tobias's view about the multidisciplinary approach, because I suppose the work that I've stumbled in around building flood resilience has made me realise one of the nice things about Brisbane is, through a range of reasons, we've actually protected a lot of the creek corridors over time. And a lot of that is actually partly because they are big stormwater corridors. And so our forebearers did realise that, keep them keeping them free of development was important. And over time, they have been retrofitted. You know, like the city's cycleways are pretty impressive in terms of what's available there. And depending where you are in different parts of the city, then it's supplemented with different park systems and sporting systems. So by way of an example, that network of riparian corridors in the city is not trivial. I actually worked at Brisbane City Council for a while. One of the first jobs I did when I came was because I was looking at water quality risks for recreational use in the city, and we actually didn't really have a good handle of it. And the first thing we had to do was know where people were actually going to be active. And so I had some colleagues map where all the riparian areas were, and it's huge in Brisbane. Like, some of it's not all open to the public, but it's sort of changing. We've had the big river openings. So there's something about water in Brisbane, and I reckon it matches Tobias's view around lifestyle. It's a huge asset. They're linear, they allow you to explore the city. So there's something there. And I think, and what's happened though, in the deeper issue that I have now is dealing with the, you know, extreme weather events, whether they're bushfires, floods, or even heat, is that these spaces now have these other multiple roles in the way. So they become, Tobias called wildlife corridors for animals. We actually need corridors to provide buffers and safety for these extreme events. And so I think this issue, like, you know, the floods we had in February this year, I think were a huge wake-up call for Brisbane, because it actually showed that it's not necessarily the river that's going to be a problem at times, it's your local creek. And so I think the realization that these areas are important to function in a way that doesn't sort of flood out people's homes and businesses are going to come more and more to the fore. So we'll see what happens with the big funding package that's coming through the state and the Commonwealth to sort of free up some of these spaces. But the interesting thing about, you know, extreme weather events, they are extreme because they're very infrequent. So it means the rest of the time, when it's not being in extreme mode, they're available. And sure, look, no responsible parents letting their kids go out in the middle of an extreme flood event or it's a bushfire. So you keep them safe. But when you're not having to keep safe, crikey, we've got this huge asset. We've got this huge asset. So I'll leave it there at the moment, because I think we're just stepping into an era where we do need to be a little bit more proactive in terms of creating these buffers. But guess what? They've got multiple purposes.
Look, I'll pick up on a couple of those themes. Thanks, Pete. We are operating under a density urban model. So in Brisbane, we're talking about, or South-East Queensland, we're talking about another 1 million people in 15 years, a 30% growth rate, which is hectic by any measure. And that's all going to be accommodated within an existing urban footprint. So more of us sharing the available open space means, I think, we need to think differently about the space we do have. I'd suggest there's probably 3 opportunities for us. One, which we're starting to see now, is private parks, private pocket parks. And the example I would use is West Village by Sekasui there in West End, that small park at the entrance, brilliantly landscaped. It's used by a lot of people every time I'm there. That was provided by the developers of that site, and it has added capital value to that project. Right? That open space has a measurable real estate dividend. So if we can begin to understand how to capitalise on the better use of open space and how that value attributes itself to whether it's the apartments or the offices or the retail, I think we would be doing ourselves all a favour by moving away from the built to boundary line sort of approach to development. So private parks is one. The second is the public parks model, which sadly, I think in many cases is a case of a large open grassed parkland, which is used mostly by the person who mows it on a regular basis. There might be a lonely metal bench sitting out in the open sun, and we wonder why these places aren't made more use of. It's very hard for governments and councils to find the funds. And I think part of the answer in that might be, I don't know why there's resistance to this, but inviting the right sorts of private operators into those park spaces, whether that's for coffee shops, bistros, bicycle hire, active equipment hire, or whatever. I don't think it really matters. One example, Hanlon Park at Stones Corner, recently a great piece of work by Brisbane City Council, turning that old concrete drain into a lovely natural waterway, which survived the floods, by the way,
Yep.
Pete.
It did well.
But there's no commerce there. And I was told the reason there's no toilet there at the moment is that there were concerns around security. So my answer to that was, well, why don't we have a concession for a coffee shop or bistro, a requirement for that coffee shop or bistro to provide toilets, and it's their responsibility to look after them. So the council is learning how to get an income or a commercial use out of that space, which also attracts more people. You've got the parents who can sit there and have their cup of coffee while their children play, and the grandparents that can come along and perhaps sit rather than being out in the open sun and so on. So it's more generationally appropriate. And the third untapped resource, I think, Pete, you mentioned this, is the creek and waterways network we have. I think in Brisbane Council area alone, there's over 1,000 kilometres of creek that is controlled by council. A lot of it is fenced off with chainmail fencing because we're concerned about the safety and security. A lot of them are concrete drains. A lot of them are just weed beds, or they're places to dump shopping trolleys still, sadly. There's a great opportunity for environmental repair in many of these creeks for water quality. There's an opportunity for stormwater mitigation or retention. And most importantly, I think there's a great opportunity for active transport along these creeks because they're flat. The odd thing about Brisbane is it's very hilly. So to make transport connections for an active transit user going up and down hills can be very tiresome. But following a creek, which is quite flat, is quite enjoyable. And some of those creeks have large public reserves next to them too, which aren't yet fully exploited. So the long and the short of that, I guess, from my point of view, is we're going to need to think differently and smarter about the open space that we have, whether that's held in private hands, whether it's held in public hands, or whether it serves other uses like environmental, water quality, and stormwater and active transport.
Yeah, I think I could probably add to that. I was thinking while you were going through all the different typologies, Ross, was if we do have to add, 30% to get to 5 million by, was it 2032 or something, we're going to have to go up as well. Density isn't just going to be a Battle Axe subdivision, and there are so many opportunities for rooftop terraces, pools that don't all have to be private, in that they can be open outside of hours, or they can have the restaurants that is the private space, and that they can be a viewing platform, or rooftop terraces or whatnot. Even tennis courts if you go to Dubai. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for at height and with some spectacular views in South-East Queensland too. Myself personally, I live in a unit in Paddington. I choose to live that way, having lived in units in Europe. So my children play on the street, on tyres put out by other people across the road. So Tobias, I kind of wish that I lived near you, because we would be there every afternoon.
Yeah, good.
But that's going to be the reality for a lot more families, that people will be living in smaller spaces and they will need access to more local things. Paddington happens to be one of those suburbs that doesn't have great large parks within walking distance, but at the same time we have a lot of other amenities that encourages us to walk further distances. I do note Hadley had their hand raised.
Just to add on that, Pamela, as well, I think exactly what Ross was saying as well. I think it's important now that with every space we do, that we really look at the different affordances. So like we don't have the luxury anymore to just do one thing for one purpose. Everything has to have multiple purposes and multiple affordances within that space. I think the other missed opportunity there, Ross, is as well like schools have this amazing yards, and they can't get used after school time. I go like, this is crazy. Like, why can't we, like, I go with my kids and played basketball at the basketball yard at the school, and then I got more or less like abused and I had to leave the side because the school was over. It's like crazy. We have all these amazing spaces that we're not allowed to use. So I think this whole idea of mixing the spaces, but also the other things, like, as we said, like in Germany, we had the Flurbereinigung. So same thing, we had like concrete channels everywhere to actually separate our lots. And now we went back to naturalizing them. We did that 20 years ago. And yes, it creates this wildlife corridors, it becomes human corridors, but then also to bring and make it playable. So everything, again, needs to be multiple affordances and needs to be more than this one thing. A bench needs to be more than a bench. A seat, like a fence, needs to be more than a fence. So again, that's why I use my 7 senses for nearly everything. I can, and if I design it the right way, and I give permission to use the bench to balance on, to climb over, to jump over, then the people would do it instead of just, oh no, it's a bench. Now, Joey, come off the bench. Don't walk over it because the next person will get a dirty pants while he's sitting on it. No, we shouldn't look at it this way. A bench can be more. So I think it's critical now as we're getting denser and denser. So everything needs to be really open and playable.
Which I think, just quickly building off that, is there's obviously some values here, issues in terms of what are the norms by which we as a broader community do things together. And the stranger danger, and the opposite is trust. So how do we build greater trust and connection within our communities? The issue about schools, I think, is a really untapped, so there's this. So why has this trust been lost in schools? Or where is the true power balance about access of these things? I think there's some deeper social issues that need to be worked through, because I think, public schools actually they're an asset of the broader community. So so locking this up, I think, is problematic, given that it's the frisbee park, it's where the dogs could go, and they're there 20, well, other than school hours, they're there for a lot of time. So, but I think there's some real permission issues there, and even the ability, and we might get to it, this ability to share the road with the way that drivers would look on how we work on our roads is also important. So I think, sitting alongside all of these physical opportunities and clever design, there's also a whole behavioural issue that needs to be unpacked to make, because I think it can happen, but we just need to get away with a few traditional values. Like when I was working in council, the whole issue about, oh, you bring these natural waterways in, there's going to be the risk. So there's this sort of there's a very black and white view to risk sometimes, as opposed to a common sense continuum of risk is, like when you go into a waterway that's got a slight slope as opposed to a severe drop, that's quite different. They're not all the same. So I think we've got to help some of our colleagues understand that. But I think there's got to be a few decision makers who really step up to say, this is so valuable, let's be a little bit more open to what the opportunities are. So how that unravels, I'm not sure. But I think even what Ross is saying in the more denser areas, like, the developers are leading by creating those spaces. So they're going to be really busy. So maybe there's some slightly different norms on how you go about doing things, but there are some solutions there.
I think it's about the risk benefit, like to really look at what is the good instead of the bad. The other thing, talking about trust, I totally agree. And I love what David Engwich always says, like what we're doing actually with our fixed furniture as well in the public space, we are telling, if you tell a child when it's born, you look like a thief, you look like a thief, you look like a thief. So when he's 18, guess what? He probably will become a thief. And that's a little bit what we do with our public realm as well. We're not having trust out there. We don't trust anybody to do, like we always think of the worst. And I have to say as well, like in Germany, you can't, like if I fall over a curb, I can't sue the council and get 50 grand because I was stupid. And I think that's obviously another challenge we have here as well, where everybody's so scared to get sued, so nothing is allowed anymore. But I think you're right. Like if we show the right things, but it's a behavior change even more than the physical ones.
Yeah,
totally agree.
Henley has had their hand up for a while.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a couple of points about that. One is that the Sakasiri development at West End, the reason that there is public space there is because the local community created a fuss and there was supposed to be more public space, and in fact it was shrunk by the developer. It was not provided freely and openly by them. That was not the way that they wanted to do it. And in fact, they had higher density on that site than they should have otherwise had. And they did that density because supposedly they had given the public this public realm. So I think we need to be looking at what developers are actually providing in those sorts of instances. I would also say that I was very heavily involved with Frew Park at Milton, and that park was actually designed, not physically designed, but the concepts of that park were designed by the local people. And what they actually did was they looked at what was around Frew Park. So they knew that at the back of Milton School, if you know the area, it had a very good playground for small children. And Frew Park itself has several things that really do, that parkland works quite hard. It has a concrete path so children can learn to ride push bikes or scooters or whatever, and for quite small children, but it's also a safe surface, obviously, for walking. There's an area in the middle of it that is a big green space, which was for, balls and stuff. It has tennis courts on it because the site was originally the Queensland's premier tennis centre. It also has a playground on it and a playground that was designed for 8 to 12-year-olds. And that playground, if you are there on any weekend or during the school holidays, is absolute mayhem. And the kids are having a great time. So what I'm saying there is, when the community was trusted to have a view on what they wanted, and they fought for that parkland very, very hard. They fought for it over a period of 10 years to stop it being developed as a huge high density development site. But they also knew that the site was actually part of the floodplains, and those areas, our councils have been selling off our green spaces and our floodplains for many years. And they also are allowing development now into the banks of creeks. And it's incredibly dangerous, and it should not be happening at all. In fact, we should be revegetating all our creeks, because when we do get that heavy rainfall, as you quite rightly pointed out in Stones Corner, it worked better than at handling the storm water, because it was the natural flow of it, than a lot of the stormwater drains, particularly around that Rosalie area, which has, like Frew Park itself is part of the creek system that runs through that area. But if you look at it across the road, all you can see is this concrete drain, which has to be fenced off because it's dangerous. But if we had it working as a creek, as a proper creek, you could then use it as recreational space as well. So I think we need to be actually talking to the residents in a lot of cases, because they bring their knowledge of an area to a discussion. And unfortunately, our councils are moving away from doing proper community consultation. In fact, they're doing everything that they possibly can.
I think we've got to be fair in all of this. Like some of those comments here, I'm afraid I just simply don't agree with. The history of the Sakasiri West Village site was one where the initial scheme with open space was traded off against height above the 15-storey limit. The council actually wanted to keep the height that where it was, and which led to the developer basically saying we could carpet bomb this site with 15-storey buildings. It was then called in by the state government, and it was a negotiated outcome. I think, in all fairness to all the parties, it's a positive outcome and one that we should support rather than denigrate. And I'd also take issue, I'm afraid to say, with the idea that council is encouraging encroachment onto our creeks and parklands. I don't see that at all. In fact, the work I'm doing, it's absolutely the opposite. But anyway, look, I mean, that's Elizabeth, you're more than entitled to your opinions, but I think some of them could be better substantiated.
Well, I can substantiate them anytime you like, Ross, because I've watched it over 25 years and seen it actually happening. And one of the creeks at Barden, I can take you to a site where they're actually allowing development right on the creek bed. So virtually, on the side of the creek, where no sensible human being would build a house. It's just appalling, the types of things that are being allowed, because a lot of the time the Brisbane City Council people, when A, we're using private certifiers, and B, if you ask them,
a political debate about council policy.
No, but what I'm saying to you is,
sorry, I mean,
that is, they are allowing development on sites that they shouldn't be. And if they actually bothered to get out of their chairs and go out to the site and have a look, you would realise very quickly that is not a site that should be built on.
I think we will, there is a slider there for some comments so we can capture some of these. The link is there to the question of where do we play in our cities and urban sprawl. But I think that also leads us to our next question, if I can, for the panel. What should our intergenerational ecological legacy for South-East Queensland be? Tobias, do you want to answer that, or yep?
Yeah, happy to start on it. Well, as I said, like another interesting thing is with intergenerational. As I said, like I think this term comes a lot now in discussions, and I just did a research with Moreton Bay Regional Council and QT over the last 5 years. And these guidelines will be published hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So we're just nearly finished, and that was on parklands. And interestingly enough, as Henley was saying, that I love the playground at Fruit Street. My kids call it the crazy playground because it is different and it is risky. And actually council signed off and was okay with that risk, which is amazing, fantastic, love that. And I think as well it's a success because the community was heavily involved. And that goes through, I guess, the design theory of place attachment. So, and I agree with that point that I found community consultation is still in Australia not done enough. So and not, or we do it, but not to the extent how we should do it. So a lot of times we're still getting architects involved, and then we do 3 designs, and then you come there with a blue dot and a red dot or whatever, rather than being like really bottom up. But I think with intergenerational, the key thing what we found in the research was, more than the dog parks or playgrounds or whatever it was all about the pathways. So the pathways are so important for intergenerational activity within a space. And the more the width, the surfacing, and the more green and blue bodies it passed, the higher the intergenerational value was. So that was quite interesting. I think for leaving a legacy, I think it is really about the education. For me, it's about the education of the generation and to be really research and evidence-based and getting, as Pete said there before, like really bringing, what did you say, like the matchmaker, being a matchmaker. And I think that's what we need now. We need to leave a legacy. We really have to make sure that in all of these amazing infrastructure projects we are doing, we really have a mixture and the right people matches in there. That it's like, that really we have landscape architects involved, we have urban designers involved, we have health professions involved. Like all of these people need to sit at the table. We can't just come from the overarching and just filter it down. We need to sit on the table to really achieve that. And the other thing is like, there's this term I love, it's called salutogenic design. So it's actually this idea of that health needs to be always in the center of every design decision we make. So again, if we just simply like look at that and go like, okay, if I do another concrete car park here, or I do a green space, what has a better health implementation? So it's obviously the green space. So how do we actually look at that differently? And then we can leave a proper legacy. How do we connect our neighborhoods? How do we make Brisbane the most livable city in the world? Like to really, and we are, a town of suburbs. How do we connect the suburbs? How do we make this suburbs more livable and connect them within the space? And then we can achieve that.
Yeah, Tobias, I'd second that. I think if there was a legacy that would be nice to see for South-East Queensland, it would be that the standard of amenity that we've brought to the inner city is also available to people who live and work in any number of suburban villages, because a lot of the growth that we're going to experience is going to occur in middle and outer areas. They're fast growing or faster growing, but we're not investing as much, in my opinion, into public open space, pedestrian cycle connections, access to local villages and business centres, and so on. You know, I mean, we spent, I think Hanlon Park, a brilliant job, was about $20 million. Fruit Park was 50 million when it was done, and that figure would be a lot more now. But you know, how much are we spending in some of these other areas in the middle and outer rings, like Merchant Park is a huge green space near Chermside, a fantastic opportunity. But it seems to be hard to justify spending the similar amounts of money in suburban areas, whereas it's almost as if there's no business case required in the inner city. And I'd say the same to the state government on that score, because largely it's state government budgets that trigger a lot of the infrastructure. It would just be nice that I think at the moment you can travel through parts of Brisbane and question how much has changed in 30 or 40 years, and sometimes it might be not a lot, whereas the inner city has changed. It's unrecognisable in that amount of time. So to deliver that same sort of outcome to suburban areas, I think it'd be a wonderful legacy.
And I think building on that, Ross, it is about what is that benefit. I don't think we've had a deep enough discussion about what that benefit is. And then, look, I work for a few resource economists who have done a lot of work on the value of open space, and that the numbers are pretty attractive at times if people are to accept some of the thinking by which it is. And it's not always tangible, it's untangible, and there's sort of flow-on effects. So there's got to be a need to take on some of these sort of deeper views on what the benefit is, because I think that then starts to change the investment approach. But I think, Pamela, to answer your question, that this whole intergenerational thing is a little bit, I put a link up to this book, Water Futures, that I was involved with, and that essentially was a whole heap of different professionals working together. Like, there was an architect who I worked closely with, and there's all the flood engineers who are very good at the techo stuff, but they need to then understand how it gets, you know, incorporated into nature-based solutions, which is what the Hanlon Park one is. Like, you know, what we're trying to do there is roughen up our waterways because it slows things down, but that's how nature operates. It creates rough spaces. So there's all sorts. So we need, into the future, needs more different disciplines to come together. So it is a challenge for council. Like, look, I worked there for a while at a time when I thought it was quite an interesting time, because there was a lot of collaboration. The water space that I was in at the time was constantly reaching out to other parts of the organisation. To operationalise it then it's not easy, because it's Brisbane is a bloody monster of a place. If you ever want to work in an organisation that has lots of different arms, Brisbane City Council is one of the biggest ones around. It's a real machine. But I think the opportunity is there. It's about making it. I think the community keeping this, and it's not just Brisbane, all the councils around South-East Queensland. Like I know quite a few of the other ones. Like the energy there, particularly at officer levels there. So they just need to be supported by their communities now and then. And, you know, I think giving good, honest, frank feedback to the councillors is an important way to do, because I think it's the staff do what they can, and maybe there's a culture thing there. But I think this intergenerational thing is one, a lot of different people working together and willing and being and giving that support. And then, you know, the ecological legacy one's an interesting one, because I suppose ecology comes in all sorts of different ways. Like where I live at the Gap, there's a lot of ecology in our backyards. You know, like I sometimes think it's sort of interesting watching where the wildlife as it jumps over from one fence to another. So safeguarding some of that. So there's some real challenges about the densification process, because if we lose some of those backyards, we lose some of the services that come there. So again, there's this balancing act. And I think part of that is we need to have some more explicit conversations about that balancing act, about what we have and maybe what we're going to. So there, I think, to answer your question properly, Pamela, it's I think the legacy is partly through the process. And so I don't know what it actually looks like, but if we have a much more engaging process where it's a little bit more open and we bring people in, like the Olympics are being used as a bit of a draw card to try and get everything right in the next 10 years. But I reckon that's going to be a tough ask. 10 years is going to come at us quickly. So if we don't have these ideas in place now, it's it'll be 2032 before we know it. So there is some. So it's a nice little urgency issue there to try and get everything lined up for the different thought pieces. But yeah.
Can I ask Tobias and Pete maybe just for an opinion on something too? So it's always struck me that we're a quite unique city region in that we've got this massive green belt to our west, stretching from Mount Cootha all the way up past Debra, Mount Mee, up to, you can basically get to Kilcoy. And the fire trails and the management trails are already in that space. There are some beautiful natural places, waterholes and so on along that journey, but it's locked up. Is that a resource that we should be making more available to members of the community for cycling or walking or hiking or something like that? Because I can't think of any other cities in this country, at least, that have so much green space, which is actually inaccessible. So we don't often talk about it or think about using it.
Like the rail trail models have been a huge success, like in the Brisbane Valley one. But look, I agree that they're like I do a bit of work with folk in SEQ water, and there has been a bit of a traditional view about, you know, protected catchments and the health risks, and I'm not convinced by the lockup model. I think there's some scope, and again, a lot of this just comes back to trust too, about, you know, the communities. Like, are the communities really creating problems? Yes, up on the Sunshine Coast in some of the pine plantations, there's been some huge issues with unauthorized four-wheel drive use there, and it's essentially young. Got to be careful the labels I use, but there's been definitely some pretty sort of full-on enthusiasts going for broke, and they've created a huge mess. So that's sort of the extreme that I think isn't really acceptable. But when you go back to the other end, where people are walking or cycling, look, they're a huge compliment. I agree, Ross, that like where I am here at the Gap, like that's sort of, you know, it's a huge benefit to be able to disappear into there. And when you think about what happens in other parts of the world, like, you know, people who go to the UK or Europe, and you can walk continuously throughout the whole country. So again, we do have a challenge with a bit of culture that needs to change.
Well, I totally agree as well, Ross. I think it's we need to open up these areas. I disagree with like some of this, again, for example, national parks. Like, I think like, and we know the more people engage with nature, the more then they love it, and then they will look after it. If you've never been in a rainforest, why would you care about the rainforest if they destroy it? So I think, again, like, there is this asset there we don't even allow to go to. So yeah, we definitely need to advocate for that. Absolutely agree on it.
Yes, I would have to say, sorry, as an avid bushwalker myself, I would, and I think I saw on your website, Ross, that you do a bit of four-wheel driving or a bit of off-road stuff yourself. Am I right? Yeah. We know that the national parks do get the occasional dirt bike riders or you know, sort of unruly behaviour, but I think the more people you have walking through there, the more policing that will be. And you know, we can talk about SDGs and sustainability and all these concepts sitting behind our computer screens, but I think, as Arnie Ruby Sims said in one of the previous sessions, you know, it's not until we get out there and get connected that we actually really truly try to protect things and advocate for things. So yes, I think we should have greater access to that massive asset we have sitting on the western side of South-East Queensland.
And I think something you just touched on that sort of triggered in my mind, it's sort of the sort of recreational, like, some of the community gardens that are popping up around the place, I know at the Gap, we've got a great Indigenous garden that's been developed as well. So I think creating slightly alternative spaces are really useful as well. Like the landscaping that's been done, like it's taken 10 years, but the vegetation types they've created on a really tough site, the side of a hill, has been phenomenal, but it's actually facilitated this great collaboration with the Indigenous people in different parts of Brisbane. So all of a sudden we've created in a garden setting, this sort of other beneficial process. So I think, to me, part of the deep philosophical thing is about connecting people. So if we're using space as a way to do that, that's fantastic. Like sometimes you don't do it that way, but you could maybe do it in I sing in choirs. Choirs are a great way to bring people together, community choirs. But I think, it's that purposing sometimes as well. Like Australians do have a great tradition of, yep, I want to do something, I'm going to do it now. I like to do everything by myself. But I think it'd be interesting to turn that around to see how we can do things a little bit more collectively now and then, because then I think you even get enhanced value and ownership, like we're saying. So, yeah.
Some of these questions around how do we do density that we don't lose, the opportunities for future generations. Pierre grew up in the Gap, and back then we had frogs in Fish Creek, which there aren't now, but it's still a magnificent area with lots of trees compared to the sort of more inner suburbs. But this, how do we sort of interact with the planning scheme and community sort of engagement better when it is part of a process. Council officers, I've been a council officer who's had to organise and facilitate massive engagement sessions on 20-year vision planning, and it's not easy to get the community involved. I've been out on the street handing out flyers at 7 a.m. in the morning, at the train station, rocking up to schools on weekends, and markets and all that sort of stuff, and it's actually a very difficult thing to implement. So Tobias, I was kind of interested in your comment around that, like we don't necessarily do that well here. And do you have any other examples, maybe from Germany of
well,
how we could do it better?
Yeah, so I worked in Germany because when I finished my landscape architecture study, there were no jobs at all. So I actually worked in a communication agency, and we did big group facilitation. So my boss, she was an NLP, neuro-linguistic programming expert, and we developed different, we use different methods that are out there, like open space, real-time strategic change, appreciation, and quarry. So really, fantastic, innovative methods that really engage everybody to come to a common goal. I don't see, I haven't seen any of these methods used here in Australia. Maybe they get used, but I've never been part of that. I think here it's a lot more about the design than we showed, and we asked for, hey, what did you like? What didn't you like? I think the challenge is we talk a lot in the consultation about objects, and that's where you always will have conflict. So if you, like the one person, I hate that tree, it always drops stuff on my car. The other person, I really love that tree because of this. But then you actually take all of this away and talk about experiences and talk about feelings and that's why I love my 7 senses approach, because it's simple. Everybody engages with it. And when you then talk to people, what they like, what kind of smells do you like? What kinds of sounds do you like? Oh, I love being in the shade. So suddenly you're not talking about I hate this tree. Okay, we all agree. We love shade. Yes, we all agree. We love to meander through a street where you have different microclimates, where you suddenly have the smell of lavender coming through. It's not about I hate this tree, I don't like this tree, I want this car here and not there. It's about the experience, and that's where we all humans more or less want to experience the spaces the same way, and we all connect to the same things from that point rather than the objects. So I think there's an opportunity in itself, and also to really use methods and to really get, the approval from the top to be happy to really start from the bottom. And a lot of times that's what we found when I did that for a year. I worked with big companies like flight centers and stuff in Germany, where the boss said, no, but I want this outcome. Well, then we can't do this process. Then you more or less top down and you tell everybody how to do it. And then they have to do it or they're leaving. So if we get it from the bottom up, and that was interesting when we did it with companies, we actually dropped the seek rate by 50%. So actually, once you're engaged, it's this whole idea about place attachment as well. The more people we get involved in the process, the more attachment, the more trust is there. So the less vandalism happens, and all of these things come all hand in hand. So I think we really need to, again, also through university, it's not even taught. So there should be part of, when we study landscape architecture, community consultation should be a massive thing within that space, and it's not. So that is, again, that's the thing. We need to be great communicators to create great community spaces. And I think that's a lot of times what it's missing. And architecture, again, same thing, urban design, it's not really taught in there.
All professionals need this. Like it's a universal enabling factor. Like in the water space, like in less developed countries, you know, some of the water management initiatives only come by engaging with communities, you know, the water and sanitary health needs. That's all about behaviour change. So engaging and working with our communities, saying like Brisbane only got out of the drought in 2005 by a huge engagement program to get the behaviour change. So we've actually done it here before. So it is interesting about how well or how much more we could do about truly meaningful engagement. And I reckon it's a two-way thing. Like I think, you know, there are pockets, but there are some communities who are a lot more organised and they just go for it. And and I tell you what, like other reason I want to go to this activity today is I want to see the local councillor. I want to give him some, you know, constructive feedback on things, but also want to encourage him that, you know, there's some good things happening. Like it's sort of, they're humans too, and they need that feedback. So I think we need to shift the top to the bottom process a lot more. So
and I think the other issue we have a lot here as well, like processes take too long. So what I found with a lot of community consultation, you get people involved and then nothing happens for 2 or 3 years. So people are, why did I even bother to get there? And also, how do we enable the everyday mums and dads? So they come to these events and then there's an architect talking in words that nobody understands sometimes, you know, like all of these things. And then you sit there and you have to contribute, but you feel like, oh, I can't because I'm not a professional. So that's again where I love some of these methods. My favorite one is appreciation inquiry, where it's all about highlights. So everybody will have a highlight from living in their community and why they liked what they experienced there. So again, suddenly you enable everybody to share a story. And then all these highlights normally have like key factors why they became a highlight. What was the success factor? And suddenly you combine all of this and then you have it. You have actually the core that everybody connected with, and then you bring that forward in the design. I think there are smart ways around that, and that's sometimes the thing as well, the processes or the projects. A lot of times when I'm involved in, it all goes so fast, so it's already too late to do anything because it just needs to get built. The developer is ready to go, they just bought the land and ready to happen, or it's too early in the piece and then nothing happens. So we lose people along the journey as well. So I think we need to back it up by, that's why I love tactical urbanism. So again, let's test some of these ideas that come out of this thing. Doesn't cost much to see, hey, does it work? Do people like it? No, they don't. How can we change things around?
Unfortunately, in some of the previous sessions, we learned that some of the community associations have sort of dismantled or become less popular since COVID, and that, you know, in a time where we really need, you know, more of those bodies and for them to get louder, the opposites happen. And so, you know, do we have also a role to sort of, as professionals, try to start and help start those up again? Or, you know, we're all sort of pinched for time as it is, but I think that, you know, some of us have the working from home capability now, so therefore do we have more time to, you know, spend an hour a day on a certain purpose, or have we all just sort of become used to just staying home and watching Netflix? Hadley, you have another question?
Oh, I just wanted to make a comment about community consultation. One is that if the community sees that you consult with them and then you take no notice at all of what they've actually said to you, then they stop being engaged. The other comment I would make is that planning in its purest form is about how we live. And if you can get to the community and say, how do you want to live? How do you want to see your environment developed? And you need to be involved if you wanted to see it evolve into the way that you want it to be. That's a message that unfortunately the council is just not sending out. And I can only speak for the Brisbane City Council because that's the one that I know about. But I do know, for example, the playground at Frew Park that is so dangerous, that was suggested by a lady who works at Paddington Woolworths because she wanted a playground that worked for her older grandchildren. Now, that happened in a community consultation where we sat around tables and everybody at the table was able to have a say. And people then actually voted. They knew that there was limited money to develop that parkland, and at some stage there would be a cut-off point for what they wanted. But that process meant that they were trusted with input, and the council, much to their credit, ran with that idea of a playground for 8 to 12-year-olds. They went looking around the world for a model for it and ended up developing it themselves. So what I'm saying is that you get ideas from anywhere and they can be really valuable ideas, but you got to hear them. That's
we have to make time. It is a time-consuming thing, but look, this is the same issue we have with First Nations issues here in Australia. Like it's 200. It's going to happen, but unless we make time, and it won't be as genuine and deep as it needs to be. So I think it's starting to become a universal issue sometimes. Like this. And I think it's a bigger reflection on society where we've been go. I think it's more about, we talk about slow food, slow fashion. We need slow living because it's sort of, anyway, let's get a bit philosophical there. But if you do that, you make time to engage with your neighbours, your communities. And I think the more that the professionals in some of our organisations appreciate that input, Handley, then I think and that we do create these good partnerships, then that is a nice way to go.
I will say to Tobias's point before about just such how Brisbane and the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, they're such large municipalities, and that with so many diverse departments, all going out to engage around their various topics and sometimes not talking to one another or collaborating well enough, the community gets fatigued with one process might be run really smoothly by somebody who has real expertise and engagement, genuinely is there to hear, versus somebody else saying that that's what they're doing, but they're there to tell. And therefore, that trust is sort of lost with the community, and it can happen within the same year time frame. And so, everybody needs this sort of re-injection of energy and, participation, I think, post-COVID, which I'm not sure how many people feel like they have that, but I think we're just going to have to push through. Everybody gets involved.
It's about then. I totally agree there, Pamela, but I think it's like when we do this engagement, and then we need to come, at the end of the day, we need to have some tangible outcomes as well. Then we have to have some actions. And then what I've found is like a lot of times the people that are the loudest in this community consultations, but then don't want to do anything. So then you need actually at the end of that, you need champions. And I always try to really break it down to the simplest things that everybody can actually say, well, okay, I'm busy, but I can still do this one thing. So it's not like, oh, wow, if I put my hand up now, I will be more or less signing up for a new job where I don't get paid for because it's all voluntary thing. So how do we actually break it down and really give the people the confidence that, hey, somebody is there with you on this journey and we support you, but you are the champion of this task now. And I think that's where we have some really great successes as well, where things real happen. And I have to say as well, before COVID, I was on so many committees, and there was so many face-to-face things. And I have to say, like, this is now nice, but it would be so different if we would be all in one room. I think like that's where you obviously get the energy, and that's where you're like, oh, that was great. We had a couple of beers together. We had great discussions. We met some people. Like here, it's like, well, I still look in this computer that I looked in the whole day. So it's harder to really get the same, I guess, energy flow through the system then as well to make things happen. So now, like, obviously it's all opening up again, but that's, yeah, we definitely need to put time and effort and resources again into that to really grow these things. And a lot of associations, like, again, I'm part of UDA with Ritva there as well. I came to a few things. I'm not on the board anymore, but it's so hard now to get these things going. And it would be a shame if these things don't keep going, because now it's the most important time that we need to have these bodies to actually engage and bring different perspectives to design, and also be really interdisciplinary. Because again, like, I'm part of ILA, but then we are all landscape architects. You're part of ELM, it's all this. You're part of AIA, it's all architects. We need these bodies that really bring all of those together.
Yeah, look, that's been my model in the flood community practice, because it's all any discipline, because it's the flood, dealing with floods actually a door opener to smart forward planning, smart design. Like it'll come, but what can we really do in advance? So and like there's going to be a lot of that happening, because I think there is money on the table. So people are looking at redesigning their houses. So like I've been involved in a project where we've looked at redesigning Rosalie in a retrospective way. Like I think we haven't shown it to the council people yet, because I think they'd have palpitations if we saw how we wanted to shift things around. But upstream of Fruit Park, you actually don't see the waterways anymore, because they're all gone underground. So therein is an issue. So once we lose the waterways and put them underground, then we get some hiccups. But anyway,
I think you've piqued Ross's interest with the redevelopment of Rosalie there. Anna, you got another question?
So I was just going to say, I think that we actually need to work with the topography of where we live as well, and acknowledge that, in fact, we all live in something called the Brisbane Valley, and we totally forget that. And the way that Brisbane is formed is all of those hills. And as I say, the older planners, they worked with what they had because they had no choice. We now can make engineering solutions, and despite what they think, engineer and God are not interchangeable terms. And every engineering solution may be a solution, but it may be a very dangerous one in the end, because we are putting more and more impermeable surfaces down. Water, when it comes, is moving faster, it's doing more damage. All of these things we need to be talking about as, yes, they are expensive. It is very expensive to retrofit a creek. But the fact is, it could end up saving millions in the end, if not billions. And I live very near Rosalie, so I know exactly what's happened there in flooding. And to have been told at one stage that the flood level there was 2 meters lower by the Brisbane City Council than it actually was in 1974, it's quite frightening when you see an organisation that you think should be protecting the residents, and in fact they almost seem to be working against you. But and I think it's a very important point too, that we actually need to have more gestalt, if you know what I mean. We need to have more professionals who do work in interdisciplinary groups. It's not only about the work that they do, it is the way that they think. And when you have a group of people who think very differently and they come together, they can often bring up solutions that they would never come to if they were just talking to like-trained people. And I think we really need to be doing more of that in planning, because the solutions that we need today, we can't look to the past. It's not going to help us. But what we can do is look at what works in various areas. Because one of the things that I personally love about Brisbane is the fact that it is a series of villages.
Definitely. One of the things that I've taken away from these sessions has been the expertise and that we have in this region. It's just blown my mind, you know, people who've worked all over the world or who have worked deeply on projects within South-East Queensland. And we just need to tap into that more and more. And that's why I think these conversations are so useful, because you meet, you know, people that you wouldn't otherwise meet in your day-to-day job. And yeah, I think it's been fantastic. So I would just like to ask if anybody else has any questions before I know Pete and Tobias have social Friday night events to go to. Elizabeth, would you be able to tell me what the polling, sorry, there was one last question in the poll, if anybody else wanted to make a comment. These comments questions we've asked have been on purpose in that we will use some of the language to start to develop our revised South-East Queensland Declaration for 2022. So, you know, the words are very helpful if you want to put some in. The last question up, I think, is, again, how do we ensure intergenerational ecological equity and development? Hadley, have you got another question? Or is that your hand up?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay. No, you're right.
There's 4 things on the last Slido poll. How do we ensure intergenerational and ecological equity and development? There's 4 things that people have added. The last one come in is listen to the community. Localization. There's a link to see Helena Norberg's Hodges recent videos and film. Multidisciplinary and true collaboration design. And decolonize. It's an interesting one, however that shapes out. Pam?
Well, that's an interesting perspective to, I guess, is that de-urbanize in a way? Everyone wants to talk if they read that, but Ritva, have you got any other comments? I know spatial justice is a big one for you as well from the organising committee.
I was typing my question.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's all right. I can say it out loud instead. I guess, like, from my experience living now in Maleny, but also in Brisbane and even other parts of New Zealand, for example, I always find that the development that we all like to see tends to accumulate in the city centre areas or suburbs that are closer to the city centre, where places are more affluent or families who are more affluent tend to live there, whereas the outskirts suburbs or the marginalised areas don't seem to have as much of that kind of access to infrastructure and funds. And how can we actually ensure that those spaces and places are also considered and prioritised just as much?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'll just share with you some analysis. The state budget, the one that was most recently handed down, for example, allocated about $2 billion to inner city infrastructure. But if you look at, say, Logan Bay Desert area, the total spend there was around 500-600 million. And the same applies all the high growth regions that you say don't enjoy the same level of prosperity or opportunity. And that's because we're not spending the money there. And I think every year the state budget does the same thing. spends the greatest amount of funds in the inner city, and that's, you know, maybe with bits of infrastructure like Cross River Rail, you can't escape it. But it's a bit hard to understand why Brisbane West, which is Ipswich, Moreton Bay South, East Brisbane, Brisbane North, Moreton Bay North, Brisbane South, which includes Logan, why all these areas are wooden spooning when it comes to the capital spend by the budgets. You know, we can lift these areas up. And as $100 million dropped in a place like Springwood, for example, has a big impact. But if you drop $100 million in the CBD of Brisbane, you barely notice it.
Mm. It's an interesting dynamic that I witnessed actually down in Geelong, where they spent a lot of money on the infrastructure, social infrastructure, sporting fields and everything in Torquay. And you had these growth areas that went from sort of a $500,000 home to a $1.3 million home within 3 years. And it really upped the price of those homes then. And I guess I question then what's accessible for lower income households. I'm not saying you should always concentrate on the jewel, but is that the argument that we need to have diversity, or is it that everything should rise together? I don't have the answer.
That's a good one, but the diversity issue is interesting in the sense that I suppose as a group of like-minded people here talking about these futures, I think there's a lot of people who has this issue so far away from their mind that I think we still have a lot. There's still a lot of, to get some of this direction happening, there's a lot of other everyday, neighbours to take along on this journey to get these other values, I think, because I think sometimes we're getting outcomes that are nearly sort of defaulting to a lower common denominator than what we would really like. So I think there is a real need to make people appreciate the greater values of these sort of, our open spaces, of our active spaces. So I think there's a bit of championing we need to do to make this issue a lot more broader, much more broadly appreciated. If there's a way to say that.
But I think that's an interesting one as well there, Pamela, because obviously, and you're right, like the more infrastructure the service have, then the value rises and it becomes unaffordable for a lot of, or people need to move out. But I think that's again where we have to have a diversity of housing as well. And this whole model of build to rent, I still like, again, in Germany, like I always rented, like everybody I know rents. Like obviously here it's a different model. Like people, like I built now my house and this is my home. I will never sell it. My kids will live in there and maybe they sell, I don't know, but this is my home. Like this is my baby. Like I spent so much time to build this thing. And here in Australia, the people, they buy a house to just make money. In 3 years time, they sell it, make money and move somewhere. So it's a totally different, I guess, again, social model, what we have here. And that goes back to this idea about behavior and about like a lot of times, even when I was renting here, like people didn't really want to invest in their neighbors because they go like, why? I only stay for a couple of years. Why would I bother to make all this effort, like to build this social trust here? Because I leave anyway. So I think this is the whole dilemma there as well. So how do we create the neighborhoods that are more livable, but then don't become isolated because everything is like $2 million worth, so nobody can come back in. So it's again like what stock we provide, what diversity of living we provide. Like not everything should be 4-bedroom houses. So we need really this, I guess, mix, not like as professionals also mix in our neighborhoods. So there are like little things where you could be as an elderly person still has this affordability. So I think that's again key of that.
All right, well, I think we can wrap that up. It's good timing. Thank you very much to our speakers and for everyone who joined us today. Unfortunately, Claire lost battery early on, and so I appreciate your flexibility with me winging it. But this will be watched by others afterwards, and I think each of us has a lot to take away from this today. And if nothing else, contacts and having met new people, which is sometimes nice in today's environment.